I came to the Himalayas to disappear, though I didn't know then that disappearing was exactly what these mountains had always demanded of men like me. My brother's funeral had been 3 weeks prior, and I couldn't stand another day of condolence casseroles and people telling me that time heals all wounds, as if grief were just a broken bone that eventually mends itself back together. The apartment we'd shared felt like a mausoleum, every corner haunted by his absence, every silence screaming with things I'd never get to say. So I bought a one-way ticket, packed a bag with more desperation than planning, and pointed myself toward the only place that had ever felt like it held answers. The sacred peaks my grandfather used to describe in stories so vivid they felt like memories I'd borrowed from another life. He would sit in his armchair, smelling of pipe tobacco and mountain cold, his eyes distant and strange, speaking of valleys where the air itself was alive and ancient things still walked between worlds. My family always dismissed these tales as the romanticized wanderings of an old man who'd spent too much time alone in thin air. But I remembered the way his voice would drop to a whisper, the way his hands would tremble slightly when he described what dwelled in those high, frozen places. Now, with nothing left to lose and everything to escape, I needed to walk where he had. Walked to breathe that same impossible air, to find whatever it was he'd found that made him look at the ordinary world with such profound and unsettling distance. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd hoped for, punishing climbs that left no room for thought, just the mechanical rhythm of breath and step, the burn in my legs replacing the ache in my chest. I hired no guide, joined no expedition, deliberately chose routes that veered away from the popular trails where trekkers posed for summit selfies and complained about the Wi-Fi. I wanted isolation, craved it like a physical need, and the mountains obliged with their vast and indifferent silence. The locals in the last village I passed through had looked at me with something I couldn't quite name when I showed them my intended route on the map. Not concern exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if they'd seen my type before and knew how these pilgrimages ended. An old woman selling prayer flags had gripped my wrist with surprising strength and spoken rapidly in a dialect I didn't understand, but her grandson translated with obvious reluctance. She says you have the walking away face, the face of men who go up but don't come down the same. I'd smiled politely and purchased some flags I had no intention of hanging, eager to escape her milky eyes that seemed to see straight through to the hollowness inside me. But as I climbed higher, her words circled back like birds returning to roost, and I found myself touching my own face in my tent at night, wondering what she'd seen there that I couldn't. By the third morning, I'd left behind anything resembling a maintained trail and entered a geography that felt older than human memory, a place where the very stones seemed to be holding their breath. The air had changed in a way I couldn't articulate, thicker somehow, despite the altitude, pressing against my skin like invisible hands testing my resolve. Every sound I made felt like a transgression, my footsteps too loud, my breathing an intrusion into a silence that had weight and presence. I'd been following a frozen stream through a narrow gorge when the landscape suddenly opened into a valley so pristine and untouched it looked like a photograph from before the world was named. No bootprints marked the snow, no discarded energy bar wrappers or cairns built by previous travelers, just an expanse of white, broken only by skeletal trees and rock, formations that jutted from drifts like the bones of sleeping giants. The beauty should have been peaceful, but instead it filled me with an inexplicable dread, that primitive hind-brain certainty that I'd wandered into territory where I was neither wanted nor safe. And that's when I saw them, the markings on the ancient pines, deep gouges in bark, that looked like claw marks but ran in parallel lines impossibly high, at least 12 feet up the trunks, as if something massive had paused to sharpen its weapons while passing through. I stood beneath those scarred trees as the temperature began to drop with unnatural speed, watching my breath crystallize in clouds that hung in the air longer. Then they should, and I understood with absolute certainty that my grandfather's stories hadn't been stories at all. They'd been warnings, or perhaps invitations, and I'd just crossed a threshold from which there would be no simple return. Something lived in this valley, something that predated maps and expeditions and the comfortable skepticism of the modern world, and whatever it was, it already knew I was here. I spent the remainder of that third day exploring the valley with the methodical focus of someone cataloguing evidence for a case they desperately wanted to solve but secretly feared understanding. The claw marks weren't isolated to just those first trees. They appeared throughout. The forest in a pattern that suggested territory marking, territorial boundaries, drawn by something that moved through this landscape with the confidence of absolute dominion. I photographed them obsessively, with hands that trembled from more than just cold, holding my phone up to gauge the height, doing the math that my rational mind kept. Rejecting, 15 feet high on some trunks, the gouges deep enough that I could fit 3 fingers inside them, the wood inside still pale and relatively fresh, despite the freezing temperatures that should have darkened any exposed surface within hours. Whatever had made these marks possessed not just size, but strength that defied my understanding of animal physiology, and the deliberate spacing between the gouges suggested digits, fingers almost, arranged in a configuration that was disturbingly close to human, but fundamentally other. As the afternoon light began its early winter retreat, turning the snow from white to blue to something closer to purple, I found myself moving faster, driven by an urgency I couldn't name, following a path that wasn't quite a trail, but rather a series of subtle indicators. Broken branches at impossible heights, impressions in snowdrifts that could have been footprints, if footprints came in sizes that belonged to creatures from childhood nightmares, and beneath it all, that persistent feeling of being observed with an intelligence that was measuring me, calculating, deciding something I wasn't privy to, understanding yet. The shrine appeared between 2 massive boulders, as if the landscape itself had been holding its breath before revealing it, a structure so ancient that the stone had taken on the same texture as the surrounding rock, camouflaged by centuries until you were almost upon it. It was small, barely 4 feet tall, constructed from stacked stones mortared with something that looked organic, like dried moss or lichen mixed with clay, and covered in symbols that predated any written language I recognized. They weren't carved, but rather seemed to have been pressed into the stone, while it was somehow soft, the impressions smooth and deliberate, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly, making my eyes want to slide away, as if my brain was protecting itself from meaning it wasn't equipped to process. But what stopped my heart, what made me drop to my knees in the snow, with something between terror and awe, flooding my chest, were the offerings arranged at the shrine's base, flowers that should not have existed at this altitude and in this season, their petals still fresh and vibrant against the white, alongside items that spoke of human visitation, a wooden bowl containing yak butter that hadn't frozen solid, prayer beads made from bone that gleamed, with recent handling and, most disturbing of all, a photograph in a weather-stained frame showing a family I didn't recognize, their faces smiling out from some distant decade, placed there by hands that had been here recently, perhaps within days. Someone was maintaining this place, making pilgrimages to this forgotten valley to honor something, to appease something, or perhaps to simply remember something the rest of the world had agreed to forget. I reached out to touch the photograph, my fingers hovering inches from the glass. When the temperature plummeted so suddenly, it felt like I'd been plunged underwater into an Arctic sea, the cold so intense it burned, stealing the breath from my lungs and sending shockwaves of pain through my teeth. The air itself seemed to solidify, pressing against me with almost physical force, and the silence that had been merely profound became absolute. A vacuum of sound so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, my blood rushing through vessels that felt too fragile for what they were being asked to contain. Every animal instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to abandon my pack and my pride and whatever foolish spiritual quest had brought me here, to flee down the mountain while my legs still worked and my sanity still held. But I couldn't move, paralyzed not by fear exactly, but by the overwhelming certainty that movement would trigger something, that I was being watched by eyes that had been waiting for me specifically, that I had walked into a test I hadn't known I was taking, and the next few moments would determine whether I passed or failed in ways that would reshape the fundamental architecture of my existence. The shadows between the boulders deepened despite the fact that the sun hadn't moved, darkness pooling like liquid in spaces where darkness shouldn't be able to gather. And I understood with the clarity of absolute knowing that I was no longer alone, that I had perhaps never been alone since entering this valley, and that whatever shared this space with me was deciding right now whether I was worthy of what came next, or simply another trespasser to be erased from a story that had been unfolding since before my species learned to stand upright. As suddenly as it had come, the pressure released, the temperature stabilizing to merely brutally cold, instead of lethally impossible, and I gasped air back into my lungs. Like a drowning man breaking the surface, my vision clearing from the edges inward until I could see properly again. The offerings remained untouched, the photograph still smiling its frozen smile, but something had fundamentally changed in the valley's atmosphere, as if a decision had been made, a door opened that couldn't be closed. I backed away from the shrine slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line, where shadows moved in ways that didn't match the wind patterns, where the spaces between trunks seemed to hold shapes that dissolved when I tried to focus on them directly. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that tonight would bring answers to questions I'd been asking since my grandfather first whispered his stories, answers that would either save me or destroy me, or perhaps accomplish both simultaneously. My hands shook as I set up camp in a small clearing with sight lines in all directions, not because I thought visibility would protect me, but because I needed to see what was coming, needed to witness with my own eyes what my grandfather had witnessed, what had marked him so permanently that he'd spent the rest of his life divided between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. I constructed my camp with the ritualistic precision of someone performing a ceremony they don't fully understand but know must be done exactly right, each tent stake driven into the frozen ground feeling less like practical preparation and more like a declaration of intent to whatever watched from the darkening forest. My grandfather's journal, wrapped in oilcloth and carried across 3 continents before making this final journey, sat beside my sleeping bag like a talisman, its pages filled with sketches of symbols that matched perfectly with those carved into the shrine, along with fragmented notes written in a hand that grew increasingly erratic toward the final entries. Words like guardian and inheritance and chosen circled obsessively, connected by arrows that suggested meaning he'd been racing to decode before something stopped him. I read those passages, again as twilight bled the color from the valley, my headlamp creating a small sphere of yellow light that felt impossibly fragile against the vast darkness gathering beyond its reach. And for the first time, I noticed marginalia I'd previously dismissed as random marks were actually attempts at translation, my grandfather trying to bridge the gap between human language and something older. Something that existed before words were invented to contain meaning. The temperature continued its unnatural plunge as full night established itself, my breath creating clouds so dense they momentarily obscured my vision, and I found myself listening with an intensity that made my ears ache, straining to separate normal mountain sounds from something else, something that moved with purpose through the absolute silence. The first indication came not as sound, but as absence of sound, a void moving through the forest that pushed natural noise before it like a bow wave, the small chittering of night creatures and the settling creaks of frozen wood. simply ceasing in an expanding radius that I could track by its very emptiness. My body understood before my mind did, adrenaline flooding my system with such force that I felt simultaneously hyper-aware and disconnected, watching my own hands reach for the knife at my belt with the detached observation of someone viewing their life from outside. Themselves, knowing the blade would be useless, but needing the comfort of its weight anyway. Then came the breathing, so low and guttural it registered more as vibration than sound, felt in my chest cavity and the hollow of my throat. A rhythm that was too slow to be human, too controlled to be merely animal, each inhalation lasting impossibly, long before releasing in a measured exhalation that sent clouds of condensation rolling through the trees like fog with intention. The footsteps followed, spaced so far apart that I initially thought multiple creatures were circling my camp in coordination. Before my brain assembled the terrifying mathematics, these were bipedal strides covering distances that required legs of tremendous length, moving in a circle that kept exactly 40 feet from my tent's perimeter, neither approaching nor retreating, but maintaining that precise distance with the consistency of deliberate measurement. Through the tent's fabric, I could see shadows sliding across the nylon, darker patches against. Darkness that suggested mass and height that shouldn't exist, that violated every principle of evolutionary biology I'd ever learned. I don't remember making the decision to look, only that my hands were suddenly at the tent's zipper, pulling it down with excruciating slowness, each metal tooth separating with a sound that seemed catastrophically loud in the measured silence of that circling presence. The gap I created was no wider than my eye, a sliver of visibility that felt both like the bravest and most foolish thing I'd ever done. And through it I saw what my grandfather had seen, what had rewritten the architecture of his soul, and divided his life into before and after. The creature moved between two ancient pines with a grace that defied its massive scale. Easily 9 feet tall, perhaps more, its body covered in white fur that seemed to absorb and refract the starlight simultaneously, making it appear almost luminous against the dark forest, moving not with the lumbering gait I'd expected, but with fluid precision that spoke of perfect adaptation to this environment, of muscles and sinews designed by millions of years of evolution or something beyond evolution, to navigate this exact terrain. Its head turned as it walked, scanning the forest with systematic attention, and even in profile I could see the architecture of its face was wrong for an ape. The brow, too, pronounced, the jaw too structured, the entire skull suggesting something that had taken a different evolutionary path toward intelligence, arriving at consciousness through biology that branched from humanity's tree before our ancestors had descended from their own trees. It paused between the pines, and I watched its chest expand with another of those impossibly long breaths, vapor streaming from nostrils I couldn't quite see. And I understood I was witnessing something conducting a patrol, performing a duty it had performed for longer than my family had existed, guarding something with dedication that transcended instinct and entered the realm of purpose. The creature completed its circuit and vanished into the darkness so completely it might never have existed, but I remained frozen at my tent's opening for hours afterward, my eye pressed to that narrow gap, my body shaking from cold and adrenaline, and the fundamental recalibration happening in every cell of my being. My brother's death had brought me here seeking meaning, seeking some kind of answer to the randomness of loss, but what I'd found was something far stranger, evidence that the world contained mysteries my culture had agreed to dismiss, that my grandfather hadn't been an eccentric old man telling elaborate lies, but rather someone who'd touched something real and been forever marked by that contact. The weight of that realization pressed against my chest with almost physical force, and I understood that I'd crossed a threshold tonight, that witness creates obligation, that seeing means you can never return to comfortable ignorance, and that whatever came next would require me to choose between the safe dissolution of returning to my empty life, or accepting that I'd been called here for reasons that predated my birth, drawn by threads of inheritance that connected me to my grandfather's unfinished story, and to the lonely guardian that circled my tent, like a shepherd protecting something infinitely precious from a world that had forgotten how to see it. I emerged from the tent at first light, with the crystalline certainty of someone who has stopped questioning their own actions, moving through the knee-deep snow toward the tree line where I'd last seen the creature vanish, following a compulsion that felt less like decision and more like the inevitable completion of something set in motion generations before my birth. The tracks were immediately visible, enormous impressions in the pristine snow that measured nearly 2 feet in length, 5 distinct toe marks at each impact point, spaced in strides that forced me to leap awkwardly from one to the next, like a child following their father's footprints on a beach. What struck me wasn't merely their size, but their precision, each placement deliberate and efficient, avoiding hidden obstacles I couldn't see beneath the snow, following a route that threaded through the forest with the confidence of territory known intimately across decades or centuries. The morning air carried a scent I couldn't quite categorize, something between musk and pine and wet stone, lingering wherever the tracks led, and I realized I was following not just physical evidence, but the creature's very presence, still hanging in the frozen atmosphere like perfume in an empty room. My breath came in ragged clouds as I climbed higher, following the trail through increasingly dense forest, where branches hung so heavy with ice they created natural archways, cathedrals of frozen wood that filtered the weak sunlight into pale blue illumination that made the world feel submerged, underwater, existing in some liminal space between the material and the mythical. The grove revealed itself gradually, the trees growing larger and more ancient as I progressed, their trunks wider than my tent, their branches reaching upward in twisted configurations that suggested ages beyond counting. And suspended within those branches were bodies, dozens of them, animals of various species encased in ice that had formed around them with such clarity they appeared merely sleeping rather than dead, preserved in moments of peaceful repose. Mountain goats hung suspended 15 feet up, their eyes closed, their legs tucked beneath them in postures of rest rather than struggle, and smaller creatures nested in the higher branches like ornaments on some vast winter tree, foxes and snow leopards and birds I couldn't identify, all arranged with what could only be described as intention, placed there by something capable of climbing with massive weight and arranging the dead with reverence. I understood. I was witnessing a shrine far older than the stone one I'd found yesterday, a place where the guardian brought those who died in its territory to rest in eternal vigil, lifted above the earth in some gesture that combined burial and offering and art into a practice that predated human religion. The sight should have filled me with horror, but instead I felt overwhelming sadness, recognizing in this frozen gallery the work of profound loneliness, of a being that had outlived its own kind and now tended the dead of other species with the devotion of someone maintaining connection to life through the ritual honoring of death's inevitability. Movement at the grove's center pulled my attention to where the creature stood beside the largest tree, its white fur now visible in full daylight, revealing not the pure white I'd glimpsed in darkness, but rather fur, marked with grey and silver, patterns that reminded me of birch bark or winter camouflage evolved to perfection. It made no attempt to hide or flee, simply stood watching my approach with eyes that caught the morning light and reflected it back with unsettling clarity. And I saw in that gaze something I'd only encountered once before, in the eyes of my brother during his final days when pain had burned away everything superficial and left only essential truth visible in his expression. The creature's face, seen clearly now, carried the weight of accumulated time in the deep lines around those eyes, in the grey spreading through the fur of its broad cheeks, and I realized with breathtaking certainty that I was looking at something ancient, not merely in species, but in individual years, something that had lived long enough to watch the world forget it ever existed. We stood in mutual observation for a duration I couldn't measure, time becoming irrelevant in that clearing where normal rules seemed suspended, and gradually the creature's right hand rose in a gesture so deliberate it could only be communication, fingers spreading wide, then closing into a fist that it pressed against the center of its chest, directly over where its heart would beat, and the meaning transmitted across the space between us with perfect clarity, despite the absence of shared language. Recognition, acknowledgement, the beginning of understanding between two beings separated by everything except the capacity for loneliness and the need to be witnessed in our solitude. The creature turned and placed that same hand against the massive tree behind it, and I watched as it traced symbols into the frost, coating the bark. The same symbols from the shrine, from my grandfather's journal, and I understood I was being taught something, initiated into knowledge that had waited in this valley for someone of the right bloodline to return and receive what couldn't be passed to strangers. It looked back at me with an expression that somehow conveyed both hope and resignation, the face of someone offering a gift they know might be refused, but offering it anyway. Because the alternative is letting ancient purpose die unfinished, and in that moment I felt the full weight of inheritance settle onto my shoulders like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable and strangely comforting in its terrible clarity. The creature gestured upward into the branches of the great tree, directing my gaze toward something frozen there among the other offerings, something I'd initially missed among the preserved animals, but now saw with devastating recognition, and my legs nearly buckled as I understood that what hung suspended 30 feet above us wasn't another creature of the mountains, but something that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my family's history and transform grief I'd carried for years into something far more complex and challenging than simple loss. I forced myself forward through snow that suddenly felt like concrete, each step requiring conscious effort as my mind rejected what my eyes were showing me, moving closer to the base of the enormous tree while my heart hammered against my ribs with such force I could feel it in my throat. My vision tunneling until nothing existed except that suspended figure encased in ice so clear it might have been glass, perfectly preserved in crystalline suspension that had somehow prevented decades of decay. The creature watched my approach with what I can only describe as sorrowful patience, the expression of someone who has carried a secret so long that its revelation brings not relief but grief for the pain it will cause. And I understood with sudden certainty that this moment was why it had revealed itself to me, why it had led me here, why it had waited through uncounted lonely years for someone of my blood to return to. These mountains and witness what had been hidden in plain sight above the world of ordinary understanding. As I circled the tree's massive trunk, more details became visible through the ice, a human figure frozen in what appeared to be a position of meditation rather than death, legs crossed, hands resting on knees, head tilted slightly upward as if looking towards something beyond the visible sky, and around the neck hung a medallion I'd seen in photographs my entire life, the expedition symbol my grandfather had commissioned before his final journey, the one my grandmother kept in a locked drawer and sometimes held while crying in the years before her own death. The recognition didn't arrive as shock but as confirmation of something I'd known the moment I entered this valley, the way certain truths announce themselves not through surprise, but through the sudden alignment of pieces that had been waiting in darkness to form their complete picture. And I found myself whispering his name into the frozen air, speaking to a grandfather I'd never met, but whose absence had shaped my father's sadness and my own inherited sense that our family carried some wound that predated my birth and would outlive my death. The Yeti moved to stand beside me, its enormous presence somehow comforting rather than threatening, and together we stared upward at the preserved figure as if attending a funeral that had been delayed by decades, paying respects to someone who existed in the strange territory between remembered and forgotten, neither fully gone nor truly present in the stories we told ourselves about family history and inexplicable disappearance. I felt tears freezing on my cheeks as the implications cascaded through my understanding, realizing my grandfather hadn't died in a mountaineering accident or gotten lost in a storm, or any of the explanations the family had eventually accepted to make peace with his vanishing, but instead had chosen something so far outside normal comprehension that it could never be spoken or explained or grieved in conventional terms. The creature made a low sound, not threatening but mournful, a vocalization that carried such depth of emotion it bypassed language entirely and communicated directly to whatever part of human consciousness processes loss and loneliness and the terrible price of duty, and I understood that it had loved my grandfather in whatever way its kind experiences love, that they had shared this vigil together until age or cold, or simply the accumulated weight of years, had taken him and left the creature alone again, waiting for the next guardian to arrive, or for the ancient purpose to finally die, with no one left to carry its burden forward. I wanted to rage against the unfairness, to demand answers about why any being should suffer such isolation, why my grandfather had abandoned his family for whatever sacred obligation was hidden in this valley. But the words dissolved in my throat because I could feel the answer resonating from the frozen ground beneath my feet and the ancient trees surrounding us and the patient sorrow in the creature's eyes as it watched me process revelations that had waited my entire life to be discovered. The Yeti reached upward with one massive arm and placed its palm flat against the ice containing my grandfather's body, holding it there with such tenderness that I understood this gesture had been repeated countless times, a ritual of remembrance, performed in solitude throughout the years since his death, and the image of this enormous creature, standing alone in darkness touching the frozen form of its only companion, shattered something fundamental in my chest, broke open grief I'd been carrying not just for my brother, but for every lonely thing that suffers invisibly, while the world continues in ignorance of its pain. When the creature looked at me again, I saw the question forming before it made any gesture, saw in its ancient eyes the hope and desperation of someone asking if the cycle might continue, if purpose might be sustained for another generation, if the unbearable weight of guardianship might be shared once more, before it becomes too heavy for even immortal shoulders to carry alone. It raised one hand and pointed at my grandfather's frozen form, then at itself, then at me, the sequence of gestures creating a lineage. The Yeti's gesture hung in the frozen air between us like a question written in a language older than words, and I felt the weight of understanding settle into my bones as the creature slowly lowered its massive hand and turned toward a section of the valley I hadn't yet explored, indicating with a tilt of its enormous head that there was more to witness, more pieces of this impossible puzzle that needed to be revealed before any choice could be made or destiny accepted. I followed through snow that had begun falling again, thick flakes that seemed to materialize from nowhere, watching the creature's broad back as it moved with surprising gentleness through the landscape, occasionally pausing to ensure I kept pace. And in those moments of waiting, I saw not the monster of legend, but something far more complex and tragic, a being caught between worlds, neither fully animal nor spirit, carrying consciousness that understood its own isolation with devastating clarity. We walked for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing meaning in this place where past and present seemed to occupy the same space, until we reached a cliff face I hadn't noticed. Before, its surface covered in elaborate carvings that resembled the symbols from the shrine but far more extensive, telling a story in images that predated written language yet communicated with startling precision once I allowed myself to see rather than merely look. The creature stood beside the carved wall and traced one finger along the images, moving slowly as if reading a text it had memorized, but still needed to physically touch, and I followed the progression of scenes that depicted humans and Yeti-like figures living in harmony, working together to protect something represented by a circular symbol that appeared repeatedly throughout the narrative, a geometric pattern that suggested both sun and snowflake, both beginning and ending. Further along the wall, the images showed a transformation, the human figures becoming fewer while the creatures remained constant, their postures in the carvings shifting from upright confidence to something that looked like mourning, and I realized I was witnessing the visual history of a covenant made when the world was younger, when the boundary between human and other was more permeable, when sacred duties could be shared between species in ways my modern mind struggled to accept. The Yeti made that low, mournful sound again and pointed to the final panel where a single creature stood alone beside a tree with a human figure. Suspended in its branches, the same image I just witnessed in reality, proving this ending had been known or prophesied or simply inevitable. The natural conclusion of a partnership doomed by humanity's retreat from the high places and the old agreements. I felt tears returning as I understood the magnitude of what had been lost, not just individual lives, but an entire way of being in relationship with the world's hidden corners, with the responsibilities that sustained whatever sacred thing still required protection in this forgotten valley. The creature turned from the wall and moved toward a narrow opening in the cliff face, an entrance I would have missed entirely without guidance, and squeezed its massive frame through with practiced ease that spoke of countless previous passages, disappearing into darkness while I hesitated at the threshold, feeling fear return now that the Yeti's visible presence no longer anchored my courage in the shared reality of its impossible existence. But I forced myself forward into the cave, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate stone walls that sparkled with ice crystals and minerals that reflected the beam in unexpected colors, following the sound of the creature's breathing deeper into the mountain until the passage opened into a chamber that stopped my breath and my thoughts and very nearly my heart. In the center of the space, protected by the mountain itself and maintained by generations of guardians, stood a tree unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined, its trunk translucent as if carved from living ice, but clearly organic, with roots that disappeared into stone and branches that reached toward the cave's ceiling, glowing with soft bioluminescent light that pulsed like a heartbeat, rhythmic and steady, illuminating the chamber in shades of blue and green and colors I had no names for because they existed outside normal spectrum of human vision. The Yeti approached the tree with reverence that bordered on worship, kneeling despite its enormous size, pressing both palms against the trunk in a gesture that combined prayer and communion and simple recognition of something greater than itself, and I watched the tree's glow intensify at the contact, pulsing brighter, as if responding to the creature's presence with awareness and perhaps affection. I understood then what my grandfather had died protecting, what the Yeti had guarded alone for so many years, what the ancient covenant had been established to preserve, not a treasure or artifact or holy relic, but a living connection to whatever force had shaped these mountains before humans named them, a biological impossibility that served as anchor point between Earth and something beyond, root system extending not just through rock, but through the fabric of reality itself. And if it died or was destroyed or simply abandoned, something fundamental in the world's hidden architecture would collapse in ways that might never be noticed, but would diminish existence for all living things. The creature looked at me with those impossibly sad eyes, and I saw the question reforming, more urgent now. That I understood what acceptance would mean, what I would be giving my life to protect, what my grandfather had chosen over family and ordinary happiness and the simple human pleasure of watching his children grow, and I felt the weight of that choice pressing down on my shoulders, like the entire mountain balanced on my decision. I stepped closer to the tree and felt its presence wash over me, like standing in the flow of something vast and incomprehensible. A sensation that went beyond physical warmth or cold into territory where emotion and energy became indistinguishable, and my grief for my brother suddenly felt different, not diminished but somehow incorporated into a larger pattern of loss and continuity that had been cycling through this valley for millennia. The Yeti rose from its kneeling position and began a series of deliberate movements, gestures that were clearly intentional communication, pointing first to itself, then to my grandfather's frozen form visible through the cave entrance in the distance, then to me, then back to the tree, creating a sequence that spelled out succession and sacrifice and the terrible mathematics of guardianship, where one life must be subtracted from the ordinary world so that something essential could be preserved for all. I wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions crowding my throat, but something in the creature's bearing told me that words would only cloud what needed to be understood through deeper channels. So I remained silent and watched as it moved around the tree, touching specific points on the trunk in sequence, each contact producing a response in the tree's bioluminescence, patterns of light that seemed to carry meaning I could almost but not quite decode. The creature paused and looked directly into my eyes with an intensity that felt like being seen through, past flesh and bone, into whatever spark of consciousness defined my individual existence. And in that gaze, I felt the full force of its loneliness transmitted like electricity, centuries of solitary vigil with only this tree for company, watching seasons cycle and avalanches reshape the valley and the world below, gradually forgetting that places like this existed or that they required protection by beings willing to step outside human time and human connections. It made a sound different from the others, higher pitched and somehow questioning, and I understood it was asking if I comprehended what would be required, not just the physical presence, but the complete reorientation of identity, the slow transformation from person with name and history and future plans into something else, something that existed in relationship to this tree and this duty above all other considerations, watching decades pass like seasons while everyone I'd ever known aged and died and forgot I'd ever existed. The weight of my brother's death suddenly felt like preparation rather than random tragedy, as if grief had hollowed me out specifically so this choice could fit inside the empty spaces, and I felt anger rising alongside understanding, because I hadn't asked for this. Destiny hadn't wanted to discover that my grandfather's disappearance had been purposeful abandonment, dressed in noble language about sacred duties and ancient covenants. The Yeti seemed to sense my emotional shift and move between me and the tree, not threatening but protective, and I realized it was safeguarding not just the tree, but me as well, understanding that humans in turmoil make poor decisions, that this choice required clarity born from acceptance rather than reaction fueled by fresh rage at circumstances beyond anyone's control. It lowered itself to sitting position, bringing its enormous face closer to my level, and began a different kind of gesture, touching its chest, over where a heart would beat, then reaching toward me without making contact, repeating the motion several times until I understood it was trying to show me something about connection, about how the tree sustained the guardian, just as the guardian protected the tree, a symbiotic relationship that would fill the emptiness grief had carved into me, if I allowed it, offering not replacement for what I'd lost, but purpose that could coexist with loss and perhaps eventually transform it into something bearable. I thought of my brother, how he'd always pushed me toward bigger experiences and meaningful challenges, how he'd said during his final weeks that he hoped I wouldn't waste my life playing "It's safe," and I wondered if this was the universe's brutal answer to his dying wish, an opportunity so extreme and irreversible that accepting it would require courage I wasn't certain I possessed. The tree pulsed brighter, and I felt its rhythm synchronizing with my heartbeat, or perhaps my heart adjusting to match its ancient tempo, and the sensation was both terrifying and strangely comforting, like being recognized by something that existed before human concepts of comfort or terror had been invented, pure presence unmarked by judgment or expectation. The Yeti watched this interaction with what I could only interpret as hope, flickering across features not designed for human emotional expression, and I understood that it wanted to be released, that guardianship had become burden rather than honor after so many centuries alone, that it was asking me not just to accept duty, but to offer mercy by taking its place and allowing it whatever rest or transformation or ending awaited guardians who fulfilled their term. The cave felt simultaneously vast and crushingly small, the mountain pressing down while the tree's light pushed back, holding space for my decision, and I realized that time was collapsing toward a single irreversible moment where I would either step forward into myth or turn back toward the ordinary world, and both choices would require living with consequences that would echo through whatever years remained to me. The Yeti rose with deliberate slowness and turned away from the pulsing tree, moving toward the mouth of the cave where dawn light was beginning to paint the ice walls in shades of amber and rose, and I followed because something in its movement suggested this procession was necessary. That revelation had sequence and order that must be honored. We emerged into air so cold it felt solid, each breath requiring conscious effort to pull into lungs that wanted to reject the crystalline sharpness, and the creature led me across the valley floor toward a formation I hadn't noticed before, a grove of trees that seemed older than the mountains themselves, their branches thick with ice that caught the early light and scattered it into thousands of dancing fragments. As we approached, I saw that these trees grew in a perfect circle around a central trunk of impossible proportions, easily 20 feet in diameter, its bark covered in the same symbols I'd seen on the shrine, but weathered by centuries into shallow impressions that somehow retained their power despite erosion. The Yeti stopped at the edge of this sacred geometry and made a gesture that clearly meant I should look upward, and when I raised my eyes I saw them. The offerings I'd found earlier magnified into horror, not animal bodies but something far worse, shapes suspended in the branches that my mind initially refused to categorize as human, because accepting that truth meant accepting that this place demanded sacrifice beyond comprehension. The creature moved to the base of the central tree and placed both massive hands against the trunk, and the ice encasing it responded, clearing like fog, burned away by sudden sun, transparency spreading upward through 30 feet of frozen water until I could see what had been preserved within, with perfect crystalline clarity. My grandfather hung suspended in the ice, not hanging like the word suggests death, but positioned as if he'd been carefully placed, standing upright, with arms spread and face tilted upward in an expression that mixed ecstasy with absolute terror, frozen at the moment of some transformative experience I couldn't begin to imagine. The expedition medallion around his neck caught the light, the university seal I'd seen in photographs my whole life, now serving as identification for a body that had become something between relic and warning, and I felt my knees weaken because this wasn't the gentle mystery I'd imagined during all those childhood nights, listening to grandmother deflect questions about his disappearance with vaguenesses about calling and purpose. The Yeti watched my reaction with those ancient, sorrowful eyes, and I understood this was the price. It had been trying to communicate. That guardianship didn't mean simply staying in the valley maintaining watch, but rather this: transformation into living monument, consciousness preserved within ice while the tree fed on something essential, using human presence as anchor point between material and spiritual dimensions. I thought I might vomit, or scream or run, but instead I found myself moving closer, drawn by the horrifying intimacy of seeing my grandfather's face so perfectly preserved, every wrinkle and weathermark visible through the crystalline medium that had held him for 40 years while we mourned and wondered and eventually stopped talking about him at family gatherings, because the not knowing had become too painful to keep examining. The ice prison extended beyond just my grandfather, I realized with creeping dread as my eyes adjusted to the refracted light, and I could distinguish other forms, frozen in the massive trunk above and below him, a vertical gallery of bodies stretching back through time, each positioned in that same pose of rapturous terror, each wearing remnants of clothing from different eras spanning centuries or perhaps millennia. The Yeti placed one hand on my shoulder with surprising gentleness, the weight of it somehow grounding rather than threatening, and guided me around the trunk's circumference where I could see the pattern, fully understanding that this tree was fed not by soil and water, but by generations of guardians who had accepted the duty and been transformed into eternal witnesses, their consciousness somehow still present within the ice, if the flickering light behind their frozen eyes could be trusted as evidence rather than trick of refraction. My grandfather's expression suddenly seemed less like fear and more like recognition, as if he'd seen something at the moment of freezing that made the sacrifice comprehensible, even acceptable, and I felt rage and grief and horrible curiosity warring inside me because part of me desperately needed to know what he'd witnessed that made abandoning his family seem worthwhile. The creature made a low sound that might have been sympathy or apology and touched the trunk again, and this time the ice around my grandfather's face cleared completely, magnifying his features until I could see the individual frost crystals on his eyelashes, the slight upturn at the corners of his mouth that suggested his final emotion had included something adjacent to joy despite the terror. And I understood with sick certainty that he hadn't been forced into this fate, but had chosen it, had walked into the tree's embrace willingly, after the Yeti before him had shown him exactly what I was seeing now. The dawn light intensified, and suddenly the entire grove blazed with reflected brilliance, every ice-covered surface becoming mirror and prism simultaneously. And in that overwhelming radiance I saw movement within the frozen bodies, subtle shifts that suggested something beyond death continued within the tree's embrace. Consciousness reduced to dream state, but not extinguished, experiencing something. Humans were never meant to experience for more than brief moments before biology failed and released them. The Yeti gestured toward an empty space at the tree's base, a section of trunk that remained ice-free and waiting, bark smooth as if prepared specifically for the next sacrifice, and I understood with absolute clarity that this was the choice to step forward into that space and feel the ice begin its work, consciousness preserved but body transformed into monument, joining my grandfather in whatever eternal vigil he'd been maintaining for 4 decades, while I grew from child to man without him. My brother's face flashed through my mind, his final words about not wasting life, warring against the terrible nobility of what was being offered, because how could spending eternity frozen in sacred duty be considered waste, when measured against returning to my apartment and job and the empty routine I'd been following since his death? The creature's eyes held no judgment, only infinite patience born from centuries of waiting. And I realized it would stand here for another lifetime if necessary, that my decision mattered less to the mountains than to me, that the tree would continue regardless, and some other descendant would eventually face this same impossible threshold, but that understanding, my grandfather's fate, was mine alone, to claim or reject, and the weight of that singularity felt heavier than all the ice in the valley pressing down on my chest, while the Yeti waited and the tree pulsed, and my grandfather's frozen face watched from 30 feet above with that expression of terrible knowing that I would carry with me regardless of which direction I ultimately chose to walk. I stood before that waiting. Space in the ancient trunk, every second stretching into hours as understanding cascaded through me like avalanche. And suddenly, the pieces that had seemed random throughout my journey aligned into pattern I could finally comprehend. My grandfather hadn't abandoned us out of selfishness or madness, but had recognized something in these mountains that transcended the small concerns of individual lives, had seen that some duties existed beyond family and nation, operating on scales that made human lifespans seem like heartbeats in comparison to the vast respiration of the earth itself. The Yeti moved closer and placed its hand over my heart, not threatening but measuring, and through that contact, I felt something flow between us, not words, but pure meaning, understanding that bloomed in my consciousness, like flowers accelerating through entire seasons in moments. My grandfather had come here seeking the same thing I had, escape from grief after losing his own brother in the war, and the mountains had offered him not comfort, but purpose, transformation of personal suffering into sacred obligation, and he'd accepted because continuing to carry that private pain while pretending normalcy seemed more unbearable than this eternal strange duty. The creature's expression shifted subtly, and I saw, reflected there, not just loneliness but relief, the anticipation of one who has carried impossible weight alone, finally glimpsing the possibility of sharing or releasing that burden. And my heart broke for both of them, guardian and guarded, caught in cycle that predated civilizations and would likely outlast them all. But even as I understood the nobility of what was being offered, I felt my brother's presence more strongly than at any moment since his death, not as ghost or vision, but as memory, so vivid it became current reality. His voice in my mind, speaking the words he'd said during our final conversation in the hospital, when morphine had stripped away all pretense and left only essential truth. He told me that grief was not meant to be escaped or transcended, but carried and transformed through the simple radical act of continuing to live fully, that the dead don't want monuments or sacrifice, but for those who survive to experience joy and connection and mundane beauty with the intensity that comes from understanding how temporary all of it truly is, how precious because it ends. The Yeti watched me with those ancient eyes, and I wondered if it could sense my thoughts, if in its centuries of guardianship it had seen this hesitation before in others who'd stood at this threshold and ultimately turned away. Whether my grandfather had been unusual in his acceptance, or whether dozens of my bloodline had refused and walked back down the mountain to live ordinary lives that left no trace in ice. I thought about my grandmother, who'd spent 40 years not knowing, who died still wondering, and felt anger flash through me, because whatever cosmic importance this duty held, it had stolen her husband and given her only questions and absence, and the slow, corroding uncertainty that comes from love, without closure, and that seemed less like noble sacrifice than simple cruelty dressed in mystical justification. The sun had fully risen now, and the valley blazed with light that made the ice-covered trees seem aflame, and in that radiance I saw the Yeti clearly for perhaps the first time, not as monster or legend, but as prisoner, bound by duty. It couldn't refuse or escape, maintaining watch over something it perhaps no longer fully understood after centuries of isolation had worn away context and left only habit sanctified as sacred obligation. Its white fur was thin in patches, body scarred by avalanches and storms and simple erosion of time, and those intelligent, sorrowful eyes held depths of loneliness that made my own grief seem shallow by comparison. The accumulated weight of watching the world change while remaining eternally separate from it, maintaining vigil over mysteries that perhaps mattered far less than the cost of their protection. I understood then that my grandfather's choice hadn't solved his pain but merely transformed it into different suffering, that the tree didn't offer escape from grief, but imprisonment within it, consciousness frozen at the moment of loss and given eternity to contemplate that wound without healing or growth, or the merciful forgetting that time provides to those who remain mortal. The Yeti made a sound that might have been in question or plea, and I realized it was asking not just if I would accept the duty, but if I would release it, whether my stepping forward would finally allow this ancient creature to rest, to join whatever others of its kind had gone to when their watch had ended in ages past, and the weight of that request felt crushing, because now my choice determined not just my fate, but whether this magnificent, terrible being would spend another century alone. I looked up at my grandfather one final time, studying that frozen expression of rapture and terror, and suddenly I saw it differently. Not enlightenment or noble sacrifice, but the face of someone who'd made an irreversible choice in a moment of overwhelming grief, and then had eternity to question it, trapped within ice while the world he'd abandoned continued without him, his children growing old, his wife mourning, his legacy becoming absence rather than presence. And I understood that the real revelation wasn't the existence of ancient duties or sacred mysteries, but the simple truth that some choices, however dramatically they're framed, are just elaborate ways of running from the harder work of living. I stepped backward from the waiting trunk, away from the empty space that had been prepared for me, and watched the Yeti's expression shift through surprise towards something that might have been disappointment or might have been relief, and I spoke aloud for the first time since entering the valley, my voice rough with cold and emotion, but steady with certainty. "I can't," I said, and the words felt like both failure and victory simultaneously. "I can't abandon the people who love me to carry mysteries they'll never understand, can't transform my grief into monument when my brother's final gift was teaching me that life demands participation, not withdrawal into sacred isolation." The creature regarded me for a long moment, and then, and this shocked me more than anything else in that impossible journey, it nodded, a gesture of such human understanding that tears froze on my cheeks as they fell, and I knew that, somewhere within its ancient consciousness, it had been hoping I would refuse, that it had been testing not my courage to accept, but my wisdom to decline, because the mountains needed no more frozen guardians, only the living to witness and remember, and then return to the world carrying that knowledge, like seed, rather than becoming another eternal monument to the seductive nobility of surrender. I turned away from that waiting space in the ancient ice, and the Yeti did not pursue or protest, but simply watched as I began walking back through the grove where frozen offerings hung suspended in branches, and with each step I felt the weight of refusal settle into my bones, not as regret but as responsibility. The understanding that choosing life over legend required its own form of courage, that folklore never celebrates because it leaves no monuments, only the quiet, ongoing work of showing up for breakfast and phone calls and ordinary moments that become extraordinary through the simple fact of continued presence. The creature followed. At a distance, its massive form moving through trees with that same unnatural grace, and I realized it was ensuring I found my way back to the boundary of this forgotten valley, performing one final act of guardianship before returning to its eternal solitude. And my heart broke, knowing I was leaving it alone, but also understanding that accepting imprisonment wouldn't have freed it, would only have added my frozen face to the gallery of those who'd mistaken abandonment for transcendence. When I reached the edge of the valley where normal trails resumed, I turned back one final time and saw it standing at the threshold between worlds, white fur brilliant against dark stone, and we held each other's gaze across that distance until I raised my hand in farewell, and it mirrored the gesture. And in that moment of shared acknowledgement, I felt something pass between us that was neither blessing nor curse, but simply recognition. two beings who'd met at the intersection of myth and mortality and chosen different forms of witness. The descent took 3 days, and I spoke to no one about what I'd seen, carrying the knowledge in silence, because some truths lose their essence when translated into language, becoming mere stories that invite skepticism rather than the transformative understanding that comes from direct encounter with the inexplicable. And I knew that my grandfather's choice would remain mystery to everyone except me, his final resting place unknown to family who deserved closure, but would have to find it through acceptance of uncertainty rather than explanation. I thought constantly about the Yeti, waiting in that frozen valley, wondered if my refusal had condemned it to another century of isolation, or whether my choice to return to the world and live fully might serve the mountains better than another guardian, frozen in eternal watch. And gradually I made peace with not knowing, with understanding that some questions exist not to be answered, but to keep us humble before the vastness of what we cannot comprehend. When I finally reached the village where my journey had begun, I found myself changed in ways that had nothing to do with ancient duties or supernatural encounters, but everything to do with having stood at the edge of erasure and consciously chosen continuation, having seen the seductive promise of transformation into something beyond human limitation and recognized it as trap disguised as transcendence, because the greatest mysteries aren't hidden in remote valleys, but present in the simple, radical act of remaining available to connection despite knowing it guarantees eventual loss. I returned to the life I'd left, to my job and apartment, and the friends who'd worried during my absence. But I moved through familiar routines with different awareness, seeing my brother in every ordinary kindness and mundane beauty, because his death had taught me that presence is the only prayer that matters, that grief transforms not through escape into legend, but through continued participation in the small, persistent acts that constitute a human life, showing up and paying attention and allowing yourself to be changed by love, even knowing it ends. I thought often about my grandmother and the decades she'd spent wondering, and I wished I could tell her what I'd learned, but also understood that perhaps the not knowing had been its own answer, that her choice to keep living and loving despite uncertainty had been wiser than my grandfather's retreat into frozen certainty, that she'd been the true guardian all along, protecting the family through simple presence while he'd become monument to the dangerous beauty of abandonment dressed as duty. Sometimes in winter, when snow falls heavy and the world goes silent, I remember that grove of ice-covered trees and the ancient being that tends them, and I send out wordless acknowledgement across the distance, gratitude for the test I passed by failing it, for being shown the seductive gravity of legends and given the strength to choose the harder path of remaining beautifully, temporarily, vulnerably alive. I never returned to those mountains and never will, understanding that some thresholds should only be crossed once, that the gift wasn't the mystery itself, but the clarity that came from standing before it and choosing the messy, complicated world of human connection over the terrible, clean simplicity of becoming myth. And yet some nights I wake from dreams of that valley with the absolute certainty that the Yeti is still there, still waiting, still maintaining its ancient watch over secrets that perhaps matter far less than the cost of their protection. And I feel simultaneous grief for its loneliness and gratitude that I'm here to feel it, warm and breathing and available to be hurt by the world's sorrows, because that vulnerability is the price and proof of continued participation in life, rather than retreat into the seductive refuge of eternal, meaningful isolation. I keep my brother's photograph beside my bed and my grandfather's name in my heart, understanding now that we honor the dead, not through monument or sacrifice, but through the radical, simple act of continuing to show up, fully for the gift they no longer have. That grief becomes grace only when it deepens rather than diminishes our capacity to love what we know we'll lose. and that the real guardianship isn't protecting ancient mysteries, frozen in ice, but tending to the living mysteries of connection and presence that require us to risk everything by remaining in the world, undefended and temporary, and therefore precious beyond any legend's promise of eternal significance. My grandfather made his choice, and I've made mine, and I can only hope that somewhere in that frozen valley, the Yeti understands that both were valid answers to an impossible question, that the mountains need witnesses who return to testify just as much as guardians who stay to watch, and that my walking away was not betrayal but a different form of honoring what those ancient places represent. The understanding that mortality is not the curse we escape through transformation, but the blessing we accept by choosing again and again to remain magnificently, heartbreakingly, courageously human. Would you accept an eternal duty to escape grief or choose the harder path of remaining human? Subscribe to explore more encounters with the legends that test what it means to truly live.